Hey guys, what I just finished doing is putting in the Accord climate unit into my CRX, and this was a job that took about 4 days to do all in because you got to get the Accord climate unit, you've got to do a bunch of soldering onto the wiring harness, and then you also have to figure out how to make brackets to actually hold this thing in place to keep it from falling into the dashboard when you press in these buttons. But it's finally all back together, and I can't believe it because it's taken me so long to do, and I had help from my dad, so that was cool. But all the controls work. The keen-eyed observers will see how these buttons don't necessarily line up, and I do have the Accord thing, but I prefer the feel of the CRX one. But if we turn on the vents, you can hear those come on. You can see how the vents are now working properly. I have a defroster, which is cool because the window was fogging up, and that was bad. And then there's also the working AC button. You just press this. You can hear the compressor come on in the car, and it's blowing cold air. That's cool. Yeah, so this took a long time to do, and what I'm going to maybe put together is a compilation of clips that were steps along the way to get here. So if you're interested in doing this to your own CRX, hopefully this will help out. And yeah. The first thing you're going to need to get to do this modification is the climate control unit from a 1990 to 1993 Honda Accord. And I was lucky enough to find one at my local junkyard. So I stopped by, and it was raining that day, so I couldn't film. But once you get into 1990 to 1993 Accord, you need to remove the shift lock and move the shifter to as far back as possible so you can get the radio out. And the radio is a bit tricky to get out because there's two screws that require a 90-degree screwdriver, but fortunately someone came in before me who already took out a lot of the interior trim, so I was able to just fit a normal screwdriver there. But getting this radio out is why, or you're doing this in order to get that climate unit out of the car. And there's no way around this because you need to take out the entire dash piece to do this. And once you get out the radio, the other top part of the dash needs to come out, and because this car was already pretty gone, I just cut through the trim, and this allowed me to get access to two Phillips screwdrivers up top, and there's an additional two Phillips below that hold in the Accord climate unit. And the most important part of this whole junkyard trip is getting not just the climate unit, because you can buy those on eBay for pretty cheap. It's getting the wiring harness, because you're going to need the connectors from the Accord in order to solder them onto your CRX wiring harness. And so once I got to this point, after I unscrewed these, I was able to, I basically tore out the rest of the interior dash at this point, but it let me get access to the two wires that you see connected to the fan controller. We've got the one on the left, which is white, and then another green one. And ideally you want to cut as much cable as you can from these, and I just used some cutters to do that, so it was pretty easy. And then once you get the unit back, in order to put this into your car, you're going to want to Dremel basically everything to make it a perfect box. So the Honda Accord one has these four little flanges on the top and bottom, and so you just Dremel those off, and you want to make it flat. And then the mixer for the temperature controller on this Accord unit only has one pulley, and the one from the CRX has two, and I didn't want to go through the trouble of adapting the Accord temperature mixer onto the CRX, so I kept the CRX mixer because that was still working. And there's just, I think, 4 screws on the back, and after you undo those, you can pull out the Accord mixer and put in the CRX one in place of that. And so on the CRX itself, after you've taken out the interior trim, you're going to find 3 cables. So the top one you see is the fan cable, and it has 6 prongs in it. And there's 2 black wires in one of those prongs, and those I'm going to have a slide of the wire map in a sec. But beneath that is another part of the controller, and this second cable is what will control the defroster and the vents, and it will open and close the vents when you press the button. And then there's also this green connector also that you need to be cutting from in order to solder that onto the cord harness that you get. And so this is the color map, and this did come from the Tennessee CRX group. And so someone previously has done this with their car, and they've identified the CRX wire code and the Honda Accord wire code on the left and right respectively. There were some omissions, and those omissions were red black on the CRX goes to red black, and red goes to red, and then also the 2 fan connectors that are black will go to the 1 fan connector that's black on the Accord side. And if you were to do this, I would recommend doing the fan controller first, and that fan controller on the CRX only has 6 pins, and on the Accord I believe there are 7 pins. And so on the Accord, the blue-red wire, the solid blue with the red stripe wire, doesn't get used because that's an additional fan speed that the CRX doesn't support. So you just cut that solid blue red wire and you don't have to worry about it. And so what I'm going to do now is show a clip from the actual part where I was doing some of the soldering. Hey guys, so I'm trying to switch out the climate control unit in my CRX, and to do that we have to solder onto the wiring harness the connectors that went to the Accord. And so I went to the junkyard yesterday and picked up the climate control unit from an Accord, as well as the wiring harness connectors from that. And so now what I'm doing is soldering it on, and I tried butt plugs or butt connectors, and the thing is they really don't hold together. They just pull right out with barely any force. So the smart thing to do if you really wanted to have a solid connection and a climate unit that'll last is to actually solder it. So that's what I'm doing, and I find the best thing you can do when you're working in really small spots like this and you can't get a helping hand to kind of hold the wires together is to make hooks on the wires like this, and it really does a nice job of kind of holding things together and giving it some mechanical strength. And so yeah, and it's also really hard, not ergonomic to work in this area because yeah, and also trying to not light the car on fire with that hot soldering iron. But things are coming along very slowly, and so it just takes a lot of patience to do this kind of stuff, but things are coming along, so we'll see how it goes. So I just finished soldering everything back together after I got everything wired up correctly. So there was a 25% chance of getting it right at the end because there was 2 sets or 2 pairs of wires that I needed to see, because the green white is the same on both of them as is the blue red. But after some troubleshooting, I got the wires connected properly, and now that I've soldered them together, if we turn on the ignition in the car, when we look at the climate control panel, we can see that the fan controller is working, and we can see that it will change the vents, if you heard that. So it changes the vents correctly, and we can turn on our defroster. We heard it make the sound, and now I have a working defroster because that was the main reason I am doing this in the first place. And then also, if I open this up, you can hear the AC come on. So we switch back to this vent, and you can hear the compressor for the AC come on too. So the AC is working, fan controller is working. And so if you mixed up the green-white wire combination, once you put the fresh air to circulate vent on, it would enter a loop going back and forth. So that's how you know if you've messed up the green-white wire combo and you have to switch the two. But in this case, because I got it working, we don't have that problem. So this has now been successfully modified or adapted. So now what I can do is put this back in. I'm going to put on some wire ties just to clean this up a bit, but it is coming along nicely. And then this is the mixer for the hot and cold air. So when you have the heater on, this pulls a little lever that goes inside the engine bay to actually open up the thermostat and let more of the engine heat into the cabin. So yeah, thanks. So to mount the Accord climate unit in the CRX will involve having to make some custom brackets for it. And I stopped by the local hardware store and I found these pretty nice things that I don't know what they're called, but you get sheet metal screws, and the sheet metal screw will grab and pull onto this part of it because it's got this nice hole. I don't know what kind of hole it is, but what I'm gonna do to mount these is put these, bend these to the appropriate length. So I'm gonna need to bend this one and take it like a few millimeters off right here and put it right here on the Accord climate unit. I'm going to do the same on the other side, and we're going to see how things turn out. And I was considering drilling into the side of this thing because it's just perfectly flat, but I wasn't able to get to the back of this thing. So I'm figuring just epoxy on this side will be enough. And to give you guys an example of what this kind of is looking like, so I bent this one. I had to take out the first bend in it and put in the second bend, and it's coming along. And so I'm just going to epoxy this side of it onto the side of the Accord unit. And the nice thing about doing this with the CRX climate units is these CRX original ones are really stupid expensive, like 400 bucks on eBay, versus these Accord ones, which are 25 bucks. So now that you've done the wiring harness conversion, you can get these like candy, and you can be a little bit more emboldened to screw around with it and try stuff like this out to mount it. So yeah, hopefully this works, and we'll stay tuned. Hey guys, so to follow up with the how the mounting's going on this new AC unit for the Accord, the little dinky metal things from the hardware store don't really hold up, nor does Gorilla Glue. That Gorilla epoxy is the worst stuff I've ever used, and it takes a very long time to dry, and it wasn't that strong at all, so it just came right off. So if you are looking for a good epoxy, I'm not paid by them, but I cannot recommend the classic JB Weld enough. And so what I did this morning, this is day 3 now of this project, is we bent some metal flanges and we lined up the holes to match up, and we just threaded them with the number 10 sheet metal screws. And I used some JB Weld between the surface of this unit, and I also sanded it to make it a little rough, and I wiped it with some Clorox just to get all the grease and dirt and other contaminants off before I applied it. And this stuff dried within about 30 minutes, and it looks pretty strong, so we're going to see how this holds up. But yeah, so if you're considering doing this to your CRX, highly recommend JB Weld. So I just put back in the climate unit with the flanges, and most of the screw holes lined up, and I was able to get 2 number 10 sheet metal screws into the unit, and so now it's held in there pretty solid with the JB Weld holding the flange that actually screws into the screw. And so we got 2 flanges on either side, so this thing feels almost stock. And so now I'm going to put the rest of the dash back together and get the radio and the trim pieces back in.